Several years ago, a guy we can call John walked into my psychology office. He was a nice, sincere, and friendly 30-year-old who felt his life was coming together. He had a nice job, he had a couple of friends around him, and he just met the woman of his dreams. Now, at first glance, John seemed to be filled with that exquisite, juicy feeling you have, when you've just fallen in love with someone. So you'd think that he'd be at the top of his world at this point. And so I asked John, well, what brings you to my office? And he said, I'm miserable. I love her, but I keep thinking about leaving her. I've even had thoughts about ending my life. Now, what was going on here? Well, it turns out John had struggled for years with intense self-criticism that kept saying things like, you suck and you're not good enough, over and over again in his mind. And while John had hoped that things would get better once he found someone to share his life with, it was actually getting a lot worse, and now he didn't know what to do. This talk is going to be about self-criticism, and more importantly, what we can do about it. And I'm not referring to the reflective self-corrective process of, I wonder what I can learn from this, which is adaptive and helps us out. Rather, I'm referring to the attacking, shaming, and condemning kind of self-criticism that John was experiencing. And I've thought a lot about this topic over the years because it's something I see all the time in my work as a psychologist and coach. Whether I'm working with a teenage girl who's intensely depressed because she really dislikes her looks, or if I'm working with an engineer or a creative artist who keep running into creative blocks because the inner critical voice calls every idea garbage. I've especially thought about this because I noticed early on in my career that while I was helping some of my clients with their self-criticism, quite a few of them actually told me something like this. Ronnie, I get it on a logical level that I'm not the most horrible person who's ever lived, but it still feels like it, it still feels like it. And these were devastating moments, both for my clients who wanted to get better, and for me as well, because, I do what I do as a psychologist to help my clients suffer less and live more fully. So this dilemma eventually led me out on a research journey to try to find out as much as I possibly could on how to help my clients end the struggle with self-criticism. It's a journey I'm still on to this day. However, I've ran into some big ideas along the way that have made a tremendous difference for many of my clients. And when this talk is over, you guys will know 3 key ideas that can help you tame your inner critic. And as a result, enjoy the benefits of increased confidence, courage, and peace of mind that taming your inner critic tends to bring about. And the first idea I want to share with you is this, that there might be some helpful intent linked to the self-criticism. Maybe the self-criticism is trying to push you to be better at something, or maybe it's trying to keep you away from something like failure or maybe being rejected. Now, I'll be honest with you here, when I first heard that idea, I thought it sounded like so much bullshit. I mean, how on earth could this destructive self-criticism that's bogging people down carry anything useful with it? But I kept researching and I kept stumbling upon the same idea in several different schools of psychotherapy and also in the research literature, where people like Paul Gilbert is finding in the UK that we actually associate helpful functions to self-criticism, and therefore we might fear giving it up. But what did all of this mean then? Well, let's return to John for a moment. Because me and John, we were getting stuck on the I get it logically, I'm not horrible, but it feels like it level. So I decided to give this idea of a helpful intent to go with John. And essentially I told him something like this. John, at times we can have competing commitments in our minds, where it's like one part of the mind shows up and says, hey, let's get rid of the self-criticism, then I'll feel so much better. But then another part of the mind scoops in and says, oh no, don't get rid of me, you need me. And then these 2 parts can start a sort of a rope pulling contest in our minds. And essentially, it just gets us stuck. Now, do you notice anything like this going on, John? John just looked perplexed, and then he said, "Yeah, I think you're onto something here." And so we decided to explore this idea of helpful intent together with some simple questions like, what do you fear might happen if you didn't criticize yourself? Or what kind of values might your self-criticism be linked to? 30 minutes later, we had a couple of answers. First, John said, I think my self-criticism is trying to push me to grow and be a better man by saying I'm not good enough. And I thought, that kind of makes sense. Trying to push him to be better, kind of like a motivational function there. And then John said, my self-criticism says I'm stupid for getting into this relationship because now she's going to see my defects, then she's going to leave me, and that's going to hurt like heck. And again, I thought, that kind of makes sense, Protective function, trying to keep him away from being rejected. Yeah. And then John said, and my self-criticism says I shouldn't get into any relationships because I just end up feeling sadness and shame in them. Now, this one was a little harder to grasp. So I asked John, could you clarify that a bit? What's this about? And he said, I need to tell you something I've never told anybody before. I was severely bullied in the army by both male and female officers and even some fellow troopers. It was just 9 months of living hell. And I decided at that point that I was never going to trust anybody ever again. And so we talked about this for a while, and then at some point I asked John, well, what's it like to look at your self-criticism now? And he said, it's weird. I've never connected the dots before, but I'm getting it. It's trying to push me to be better, and it's trying to keep me away from ever again feeling that awful pain of rejection I felt in the military. I get it, and I'm even feeling some warmth towards it. Now, this caused a shift in John, because up to this point, he'd seen his inner critic as something that he needed to get rid of. And now it just looked a bit more like, an unhelpful helper. And this is a rather universal tale when it comes to harsh self-criticism. If we look behind the angry facade, we'll often find fierce and important values. It's like the inner critic, it's kind of like an angry sports coach, really, that wants you to succeed, and then it does the only thing it knows how to do. It yells and it screams at you, and essentially it freaks you out, and it doesn't help you grow or develop at all. So maybe this is an idea that can help you with your inner critic. Try to look behind the angry facade and see if the inner critic maybe is trying to keep you away from some pain, maybe trying to help you get something like love or approval, or maybe it's trying to push you to be the kind of person you want to be, but with a really poor execution style. Now, was this all it took for John to get better? Well, not quite. He certainly felt better in the session, and he sensed that something had shifted inside, and then he came back a week later and he told me that it's a little less intense, but it's still taking me over. And that's actually a very common experience. I think most of us have had the experience of having just beautiful insights about ourselves or about how the world works that still don't translate into any real change. So what else could be done? Well, let's take a look at key number 2 for taming the inner critic, which is taking a step back. This is something I first stumbled across in some modern forms of psychotherapy. And it has its roots in our ancient wisdom traditions that talk about things like mindfulness and meditation. So what would taking a step back look like? Let's return to John for some clarification. Now, first John, if you imagine that my hands here represents John's self-criticism, then we could say that his self-criticism was right here in his face a lot of the time, criticizing, shaming, and condemning him. Now, naturally, at this point, he'd feel really bad about himself, and he'd also have a hard time doing anything that really mattered to him. And I described this to John, and he said, yeah, that's exactly what it feels like. And so I suggested to John that we try to find a way for him to take a step back. So essentially, just getting some distance from the critic, even to the point that the inner critic would move into the role of a radio playing in the background. Still playing its critical tune, but without all that much impact. And John really liked this idea, so we talked about it for a while, and then he came up with this really cool idea. And he said, I'm going to give it a name. Yeah, I'm going to call it Sucky Johnny, because that's what it felt like back in the military. and John really started playing around with this idea, and whenever the self-criticism would show up, he'd just go, oh, it's Sucky Johnny paying me a visit again. And he'd scoop it to the side a bit and keep doing whatever he was doing, and it seemed to help him out quite a bit. And I know this idea might sound a bit silly, so I want to emphasize that the idea isn't to ridicule yourself or ridicule your self-criticism, just to get some distance. And the science behind this idea is solid, indicating that distancing ourselves from psychological distress can be highly useful. So I suggest you give it a try with your own self-criticism. You could try writing your critical thoughts down on a piece of paper and then distancing yourself from the paper. The artistically inclined among us could try drawing the inner critic and maybe add a funny hat while you're at it and then distancing yourself from the drawing. Or you could give it a name, like John did. But try to find a way to take a step back and see what happens. There was one more thing we needed to consider with John, though. How would he find the courage to be trusting and vulnerable in his relationships again? Well, let's take a look at key number 3 for taming the inner critic, which is cultivating a compassionate coach inside. So essentially, we're talking about swapping out the angry sports coach and instead bringing in a more kind and compassionate point of view. That will allow us to access our inner guidance, our inner courage, and our inner commitment to things that matter to us. And this is an idea that's been shown to significantly lower a sense of depression, shame, and chronic self-criticism in multiple research studies over the last 10 years. In some cases, even after just 2 weeks of practice. So what does this idea look like? Let's see how John applied it. He liked this idea of an inner coach, so we spent quite some time thinking about what it would be like if he were a compassionate coach to himself. What kind of words he would say to himself, what kind of voice tone he would use. Would it be really forced, or would it be calmer and maybe a more reassuring voice tone? How he would hold his body, how he would breathe, would it be shallow or deeper, and so on. And John started practicing this idea just for a couple of minutes every morning. And he told me that I get up in the morning, and then I just try to step into the role of a compassionate coach. So I get into the steady body language, I breathe a bit deeper, and then I try to think about some way that I could dare in my relationship today. And then I offer some encouraging words to myself, like, I know it's a bit spooky, but you can do it. Go for it, this is important to you. And then one day John came to my office, he had a huge grin on his face, and he said, I just told my girlfriend about the military experience. It just all poured out of me. And then we had the most amazing talk ever. And later on, the most amazing sex ever. Now, John was clearly learning that it might be okay to be trusting and vulnerable in this relationship. So soon enough, our work together was complete. And I hadn't heard from him in a couple of years, actually, until I got an email from him last year where he said, I just got married. And P.S., Sucky Johnny still shows up at times, but I try to treat him kindly. I think John's story showcases how some key ideas can help us grow out of old patterns, like self-criticism. So if you notice that your inner critic is giving you a hard time, why not give these ideas a shot? Number 1, try to understand the helpful intent. Number 2, take a step back from the criticism. And number 3, cultivate a compassionate coach inside. And as you access compassion for yourself, I believe that you engage in helping both yourself and everybody around you. As the great author and professor Leo Buscaglia once wrote, "Forgive yourself and be good to yourself. For without you at your best, the rest of us are missing out on many wonderful things." And I hope this talk has given you some ideas for how to be good to yourself and others. Thank you.